When we think about the first Europeans showing up in the Americas, a certain picture comes to mind, right? Conquest, cruelty, the usual story. But what if I told you that one of the earliest, most detailed accounts was, well, something totally different? A story not about conquering others, but about a profound self-critique of Europe itself. Let's dig into this.
Okay, get this. In 1934, the absolute legend of anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, gets to Brazil. And what's his #1 guide? Not some fancy new map, but a book written almost 400 years earlier by a Calvinist pastor. He literally called it the breviary of the anthropologist, like the essential handbook for understanding human beings.
And that's the big question for us, isn't it? What on earth did this pastor, a guy named Jean Dallaire, see among the Tupinamba people of Brazil that was so revolutionary, so completely different from the story we all think we know?
So, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to meet our unexpected anthropologist and check out the humanist lens he was using. Then, we'll see how he turned that mirror back on Europe, compare his view to what came later, and wrap up with why all this context really matters.
All right, first up, our main character, Jean Dallaire. And let's be clear, he was not your typical conquistador. He wasn't even an explorer, really. He was a pastor sent by John Calvin himself to a brand new French colony in Brazil.
Now check out this timeline. Lévi goes to Brazil way back in 1556, but he doesn't actually publish his book for more than 20 years. So why the long wait? Well, because in between he lived through the absolute horror of the French wars of religion. He survived massacres, he survived a siege where his so-called civilized countrymen were reportedly eating each other to survive. That experience of barbarism at home changed everything. It completely shaped how he wrote about the so-called savages he met abroad.
And that brings us to the whole intellectual vibe of the time, the humanist encounter. See, Larry wasn't just reacting to violence, he was part of a movement that had a very specific way of looking at the world.
They called it the humanist gaze. Basically, it was all about trusting what you saw with your own two eyes over what some old book told you. I mean, look at his own words right here. I am speaking from my own seeing and experience. This wasn't about judging people based on some rigid religious checklist. It was about comparing cultures, often with a good dose of humor, to better understand and criticize your own. And here's exactly how he did it. He'd look at the Tupinamba, naked, covered in feathers and tattoos, and instead of just calling them primitive, he'd compare them to the latest Paris fashions. His takeaway? That European clothes were mostly about ego and showing off, that military uniforms were way sillier than feathers, and that a loud, honest Tupi greeting beat the stuffy, empty rituals of the French court any day. And this, right here, is the heart of his entire project. He wasn't just writing a travel guide. He was using the New World as a giant mirror to force Europe to take a hard look at itself. Now, Larry does not pull any punches. He's totally upfront about what he saw, and that included ritual cannibalism. The Tupinamba would capture enemies, treat them well for a bit, and then, in a big ceremony, kill and eat them to mark a victory. Now, for most people, that's the end of the story, right? Just pure, undeniable savagery. But not for Lenbry. No way. He puts these two versions of barbarism side by side and asks a simple question. Which one is actually worse? Is it the Tupi, who kill their enemies quickly in a ritual? Or is it the Europeans, who imprison and torture people for months on end, who carry out these massive, bloody massacres over religious disagreements? And then, and this is just brilliant, he accuses European moneylenders of their own kind of cannibalism, using insane interest rates to suck the blood and marrow from the poor. And this quote just lands like a bombshell. He's basically telling his readers in France, "You're shocked by these people in Brazil? You don't have to go to America to see monsters. Just open your eyes." His book was never really just about Brazil. It was an all-out assault on a France that he believed was literally eating itself alive. But this kind of nuanced, self-critical view, it didn't last. Fast forward to the 17th century, and a totally different way of thinking starts to take over among Protestants back in Europe.
And the big reason for this shift is a process historians call confessionalization. To put it simply, this is when kings and rulers decide that for the nation to be strong, everybody needs to believe the exact same thing. It's all about enforcing one single version of the truth to build up state power. So this new way of thinking was all about classification and control. You could almost call it the intellectual software update that made large-scale colonization possible. Everything had to be sorted into neat little boxes, true or false, us or them. All that messy ambiguity and self-critique from Leary's time, gone. The new goal was to draw sharp lines in the sand that would justify the power of the state and its growing colonial machine. Which brings us to the main takeaway here. Context is everything. The way Europeans saw people in the New World was almost always a direct reflection of the political and religious fights they were having back home.
And there's this one fantastic, almost funny story from another 16th century Protestant expedition that just captures this perfectly. These French guys are in Florida, and they put up a big stone column to claim the land for France. They leave, they come back later, and they find the local Tumiquan people have covered it in flowers and are worshiping it like a god.
And here's the best part. The Tumiquan chief asked the French to kiss the stone as a sign of respect. Now, for these Protestants who hated Catholic idol worship, this is their worst nightmare. But as their leader wrote, what could they do? For the sake of friendship, for diplomacy, they had to do it. And that one awkward moment is the 16th century in a nutshell. It was complicated, it was messy, and full of these uncomfortable compromises.
Okay, so let's put a bow on this. The first big point is this. The 16th century French Protestants, guys like Larry, were a persecuted minority. They were fighting just to exist in Catholic France. So they used the New World as a mirror. They used it as a tool to argue for toleration, basically by saying, hey, maybe our civilization is even more barbaric than these so-called savages.
But by the 1600s, the game had totally changed. Later Protestants, especially from England and the Netherlands, weren't just asking for toleration anymore. They were building empires. Their goal was power. It was control. And so for them, the New World wasn't a mirror for self-critique. It was a subject to be classified, categorized, and ultimately controlled.
Which leaves us with one last question to think about. If all this history shows that the way we see other cultures is so often just a reflection of our own society's problems and goals, then what do our modern judgments about the rest of the world really say about us?